So what I want to do here this morning is I want to share with you soil health, kind of a big picture view of soil health, but I want to do it from the perspective of comparing it to the economy of a country. And I think it'll be a little bit different take than what you maybe have heard before, but it helps me put things into perspective, helps me understand things a little bit better. Just a little bit of background, we've been no-tilling for 30 years. We're in Webster County, just 30 miles south of Hastings. We're about half dry land, half irrigated, corn, bean, and cereal rotation. But since we kind of started down this path to soil health, we've added other things into our rotation: rye, triticale, oats, barley, vetch, sunflowers, buckwheat. So we've really diversified what we've been growing. Our farming background, we've been growing cover crops now for 10 years. We started green cover seed back in 2009. And just to give you an idea or a picture of how fast this whole soil health industry has grown, when we first started selling cover crops in 2009, we sold enough seed to cover about 1,000 acres. This year in 2019, we'll sell enough cover crop seed for probably somewhere between 900,000 and 1 million acres. So it's kind of grown that fast. You can see this is our facilities here. 10 years ago, none of those buildings were there. In fact, in 2011, we built the first building. Put this down a little bit. And it's kind of grown that fast just to kind of keep up with the demand. We were very fortunate a few years ago. One of the blessings that we've had is we've got to meet a lot of people, have a lot of experiences. The Soil Health Institute came to us and they said they were making a documentary on soil health called the Living Soil Series. And they wanted to feature our farm in it. And one of the things they wanted to do, which by the way, if you have not seen this, I highly recommend it. It's free. You can go watch it online. Just go to livingsoilfilm.com. It's about an hour long, and they feature farms from all over the United States and give a really good picture of soil health. So livingsoilfilm.com. But one of the things they wanted to feature us doing is, we always try to get something growing. We want to have something planted after we get harvested. So we have the combine out here in the field harvesting corn, and then we have the air seeder out here. We're planting a cover crop at the same time, and they wanted to film that. So we said, yeah, come on out, that would be great. And so I want to show you this. So they sent the drone crew out. So I had the hired man go hook up the big air seeder, and I jumped in the big four-wheel drive tractor, and I took off. And here's this beautiful day in October, and I jump in this big tractor, and I take off thinking, man, this is going to be great. This is going to be part of a movie, going to be part of the film series. I just was thinking all these different things about how great this was, how cool this was. About just the time when you think things can't get too much better than that, you really got to watch out. So I show that because it gives me instant credibility as a farmer, because only a farmer would do something that stupid, right? So, yes, we are real farmers. Bad things happen. I'm sure that everybody who's farmed for very long, something like that has happened, but I could almost guarantee you that none of you have that captured on high definition drone footage. It is our most popular video on YouTube, also, kind of like this. We like watching the suffering and pain of others, right? Okay, so I am going to talk today about soil health, and like I said, I'm going to compare it to the economy of a country because there's so many parallels between what goes on in the soil under our feet and what goes on in the economy of the country. And if you remember back to your economics class in high school or college, there's some basic principles of economics that have to be in effect for you to have a healthy economy. I have them listed there. We'll go through them in more detail one by one, but I'm going to be looking at how they apply to our soil and not just to the economy of the country. And so we'll compare them to the soil. So first of all, our soil economy is based on solar energy. As farmers, really all we're doing is we're collecting solar energy, we're turning it into something that we can sell. So we always have to remember that. But the three main players within the economy that we're dealing with is the soil, that's obvious, plants, we know we have to plant something to grow, but the thing that we often forget about and is often overlooked is the animals. And I'm not going to spend too much time today talking about cattle and sheep and the large animals. They are important, but I'm not going to be talking about that. What I'm going to be talking about are the microscopic animals, because we all have these. We don't all have cattle, but we all have biology. Everything from earthworms to bacteria to fungus, they play such an important, crucial role in what we're doing. And when we don't have them as part of our economy, then the whole thing breaks down. The whole thing does not work the way it was created. Because when the system was set up and created, it was created for the plants, the biology, and the soil to all work together. So let's look at these economic principles. The first one is supply. We all know about supply. So in this economy, plants are supplying carbon. Okay, if you don't remember anything else, just remember this is photosynthesis. This is the most important, fundamental chemical formula in the world. And I know it's not balanced on both sides of the equation, so forgive me, it's a simplified version. But CO2, which some people consider to be a waste product, we have too much of it, we need to get rid of it. It's plant food, okay? That's what plants need. They take CO2, they add water to it through the energy of the sun and the chlorophyll plast of a cell. They turn that into C6H12O6, which is glucose. It's a very simple carbohydrate sugar, and oxygen. So it's taking a waste product and water and turning it into a very valuable glucose sugar and oxygen. Oxygen is a byproduct in this process, but it's very important for anyone who likes to breathe. Okay, that's a little extra bonus for us here. But this is what we're going to focus on right here. Plants are taking CO2, which is a waste product, and they're turning it into C6H12O6. And this carbon molecule right here is going to get changed into many, many different types of carbon within the plant and within the economy of the soil. But plants are producing that carbon. Nothing else can do that. Animals can't do that. They emit CO2. They can't take it in and do something with it. So plants are unique in their ability to do this, and that's extremely important. The soil is providing minerals through nutrients for our plants. I don't know how well you can see this. This is a list of all the things plants need to grow, or a partial list. Ignore nitrogen for right now. We'll talk about that later. But most of the rest of these, potassium and phosphorus and calcium, magnesium and iron and manganese and boron, and the list goes on. These are minerals that are contained in our soils that plants need to grow. They're in our soils. Now, plants can't always get them, so we have to add them in certain amounts later on, but we'll look at how the soils are providing that and what the plant needs to do with it. Soil also provides a habitat for the roots and for the biology. It gives them the place to grow and to live, very important, and it also provides water storage, which again, sometimes we often overlook how important our soil is for storing water until it no longer works. And we can talk forever just about how important of a function that is, but that's one of the things that they're contributing to this economy. And then the biology, they're producing nutrients through nitrogen fixation. We'll look at that process in some detail, but they're also making some of these nutrients available to the plants through cycling and through other biological processes. And then they're also providing a lot of defense and protection mechanisms. Again, when we look at the way the system was created to work, these are all of the jobs that the biology has to do, but when we no longer have the biology in our soil, these don't get done. And we'll look at what happens there in a little bit. So the second economic principle is demand, because you have to have supply, you have to have demand. Plants need nutrients, they need water, they need services, they need protection, they need support. I think as farmers, we all pretty much understand what plants need. Our soil, however, it needs carbon. Soil without carbon is not going to function properly. And we'll look at the role that carbon plays, thus the term carbonomics for this whole talk. But when your soil is losing carbon, it is not getting better, it's getting worse. And you don't need a test to tell you that. You can just look and see by the color. Because the lighter the color of the soil, the less carbon that it has, the darker the soil, for the most part, the more carbon it has. And if you would look at your soils after farming them for years and years and years, are they darker or are they lighter than they used to be? It all depends on how you've been farming, and we'll look at that. But it also needs services, because soil can do a lot of cool things, but the one thing that it cannot do is it cannot protect itself. And if you have bare soil, it is going to be susceptible to erosion through rain and through wind. And it cannot protect itself. It needs other people within the economy to provide those services to protect it. We have a saying on our farm, I never want to see my soil unless I go looking for it. I want to have to scrape away the residue from on top of the ground in order to see my soil. If I can walk out there and see my soil, we've done something wrong. Now, we may have done everything right, but the weather didn't cooperate, we didn't grow the cover that we thought we would, but we don't like it when we can walk out there and see our soil. We want to see it covered at all times. And then biology, they're living organisms like you and I. They need simple things like food and a place to live. And if you provide those things for them, they're going to do some pretty amazing services within this economy, and it's pretty amazing how cheap they work. So in a strong human economy, kind of like what, the United States is a very strong economy right now, one of the leading indicators is low unemployment. There's a very low unemployment rate in our country and within our state. And if you don't believe that, just go out and try to hire people. There's not a lot of people out there looking for jobs, because anybody that wants a job probably has one. That's because everybody is producing and they're consuming and they're making a contribution to our economy. And our soil economy is no different. It is the strongest when everybody is supporting it, when they're all providing something, they're all part of the supply chain, they're all demanding things. That's when it's most important, when everybody is contributing here. And diversity is very important, because when we don't have diversity, then our economy can get really skewed. It would be almost like if everybody just grew corn and soybeans. Oh, no, wait, we do. And look at our economy, right? Look at the farm economy, because we're not very diverse. And it's the same way in our soils. When we have too much of one thing and not enough diversity, we're susceptible to big ups and big downs. So here's what happens. And don't think that I'm saying this, I'm not preaching to you, I'm preaching to myself as well. Because when I talk about this, we're still trying to learn all this on our own farm. But if we're going to talk about it in terms of an economy, we have to talk about welfare. And what we do in our farming systems today, we do this ourselves, we provide agricultural welfare. Because here's what happens. When we externally provide the plant with all the things that it needs from the outside, particularly crop protection and fertility inputs, when we provide everything that it needs from the outside, we weaken the economy. Because essentially what we're doing is these are jobs that the biology is supposed to do and used to do and can do, but when we don't encourage the biology, or we don't farm in such a way where we have biology, then our plants start to get sick. They start to look yellow. And so then we have to come in from the outside and rescue it with these treatments. Now, I'm not here saying we should eliminate all this, because that's not our goal. Our goal is to reduce it. Because one of the reasons that most farmers have very low margins or very little profitability, ourselves included, is because we're spending so much of our money putting these inputs into the system that it's taking everything that we're getting out, has to go right back into it. So in order to be more profitable, we have to figure out how to reduce this as much as possible. Some people haven't completely eliminated it, but that's a pretty big mind shift. That's not necessarily what our goal is, but we want to reduce our inputs so that we become more profitable. I like what Abraham Lincoln said about welfare. He says you cannot help men permanently by doing for them what they could and should do for themselves. And I like this quote because notice he's not saying we should never help people. We do. When people need help, we need to help them. But he says we're not going to help them permanently if we continue to do for them things that they should be able to do for themselves. And it's the same way with our soils. We're never going to build our soils. We're never going to get them healthier. We're never going to get them to the point that they need to be to sustain the production that our world is going to need in the upcoming years. We're never going to get them to that point if we continue to do for them everything that they could and should do for themselves. So we need to start reducing our inputs, allow the soil to do more what it was created to do, and build in more profitability without really giving up a lot of the yield. Allow the system to work the way it was created to work, and mostly bringing the biology back into the system. And again, on our farm, we don't have all the answers, okay? I'm going to just be perfectly honest. We don't have all the answers, but I think now we're at least asking the right question. And the right question for us anyway, now when we make a decision about what to do on the farm, we ask ourselves, how will this affect the biology? Because we've learned that so much of what happens is biological, and before when we just ignored it, generally when you're putting stuff on, it's going to affect the biology negatively. So now we're asking ourselves, okay, if we put this spray on or this fertilizer on, how is that going to affect the biology? So we don't have all the answers, but we're at least asking the right questions. Okay, so we have supply and we have demand, and then in order to get supply and demand to come together, you have to have currency. Because currency allows buyers and sellers to get together and make quick, efficient transactions very efficiently. We've got these standardized currencies across the world, but if we were just trading cows and beans or things like that, we could still get some things done, but it would be really awkward, it would be clumsy, it would not be quick, and it would not be efficient. So currency allows that to happen. And in our economy, in our soils, we have the perfect currency, and that currency is carbon. Okay, carbon is the currency. Again, remember this is photosynthesis. We are making the carbon, this glucose molecule, we're making it literally out of thin air. We're pulling this out of the atmosphere, adding water, voila, we have this. So probably growing up, you probably heard, and you probably all told your kids this saying, money doesn't grow on trees, okay? You've all heard that, we've all said that, but guess what? In our economy, it literally does. Our currency does grow on trees, and it grows on corn plants, and soybean plants, and wheat plants, because we are literally manufacturing the currency through photosynthesis that drives this whole system. Here's how it works. You have the plants who are photosynthesizing, and they are creating this carbon. They're making that glucose molecule, but the plant doesn't hold on to all that glucose. It doesn't hold on to all that carbon that it pulls out of the atmosphere. A great majority, a lot of it will leak out through the roots, and I've got a really cool picture later on that shows this happening. And experts will say as much as 40 to 50% of the carbon that a plant pulls out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis, as much as half of that is not used for the plant to grow new leaf material or roots or stems or pods or seeds. As much as half of that is leaked out through the root system into the surrounding soil. Okay, and that's what this represents here, these root exudates, and then the biology will come and they will consume that because that's their food supply. But just like in our life, there's no such thing as a free lunch for these guys. They have to provide something back to the plant in order for the plant to keep feeding them. Okay, so they have to be sourcing nutrients or delivering nutrients or providing protective services, because if the plant is putting carbon out of its root system, and they're seeing no return from it. Okay, plants aren't stupid. In fact, they're probably smarter investors than a lot of people I know. If they're not getting a return on their investment, they'll stop it. Okay? So your plants can photosynthesize much more than they're already doing, but if there's nothing there to feed, they're not going to leak out those carbon root exudates. And when they're not leaking out those root exudates, you are not getting the carbon into your soil that you normally should be or that you need to be. And so when we farm in an absence of biology, or we have very low biological levels, your plants kind of get lazy. Because if there's nothing there to consume the root exudates, they're not going to produce them. But when we do have the biology, this plant is perfectly capable of photosynthesizing more than it does. And it can put these root exudates out without stealing any carbon for that plant itself. And so it can ramp up its production if there's something there to feed. And when these guys are here, they're going to be paying, they're going to be trading, very valuable services to this plant. So this is what makes it a perfect economy. You've got the plant, you've got the biology, the carbon is what ties them together. The carbon is the currency that the plant uses to pay for these goods and services. Again, think about carbon as a currency. Carbon is essential to all life forms. You and I are 19% carbon. Carbon can form over 10 million different compounds, chemical compounds. It starts out as glucose. It does not stay as glucose for very long. It'll strip that carbon molecule out of that glucose molecule, and it will form all these other chemical compounds. We'll talk about what some of them are here as we go. It's the most important but the most overlooked of all plant nutrients. How many of you sat down with your agronomist in the winter and you say, well, let's talk about how much carbon our plants are going to need? Nobody talks about that. You talk about nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, all these other things. We never talk about carbon. Okay, but carbon is essential. Now the reason we don't talk about it is because they can pull that literally out of the air, and they do, but we should be talking about how important that is, not just to the plants, but to the whole system. And it's the main food source for soil biology. So you are not going to have soil biology in your soils if they don't have a food source, which is carbon. And you're not going to have the carbon into the soil unless you have a growing plant. And that's why cover crops are so important, because when we're growing corn and soybeans, we really only have active root exudates going into the soil probably between 3 and 4 months a year. There's 12 months in the year, and you might say, well, you know, but like this time of year, nothing's going to grow this time of the year. Not true. I've got cereal rye planted on all my acres. It's nice and green. It's not very big. You can just barely grow it, but it's going to get bigger, and it's green and the sun is shining. It is photosynthesizing. It is putting carbon into the soil, and it's feeding this biology. Now, when it gets cold, everything slows down, but it doesn't completely stop. Again, carbon is so important because when we have carbon in our soil, it normalizes our pH. So if you're too high or too low, more carbon in your soil will normalize that. It'll kind of buffer that. It increases the cation exchange capacity. It increases the availability of all of these essential nutrients for the plant, and it can help reduce the availability of things that can build up to toxic levels like sodium and aluminum. Carbon is a perfect currency because we can collect it through photosynthesis. We can spend it when it's traded to the soil organisms. We can save it through soil organic matter, which we'll talk about next. And it's desired by all members of the economy. Everything in that soil lives off carbon and it desires carbon, so it's the perfect currency to drive the whole system. It's just a matter of, can you get enough into your soil to make it work? Further, as a currency, it has different states. Just like I've got a credit card, I've got cash, I can write a check. Carbon is different states. We've got the gaseous form of CO2, we've got liquid carbon, which flows up and down through the plant, through the soil as liquid. And then, of course, you've got solid carbon, which once it's consumed by an organism, it becomes part of their living material, becomes a solid material. And it can shift from one state to the other very, very quickly. Christine Jones, who is one of the most, I think one of the best microbiologists in the world from Australia. Many of you probably have heard her at different events around Nebraska. She says that carbon can go from the gaseous state, changed into liquid, move through the plant, into the soil, and into a microbe within a matter of hours. So carbon can go to all three states in a very, very short period of time. It's the perfect currency for driving all this. And then in our economy, once you have currency, once you have excess currency, now you can start to save it. Now you can turn it into capital. Because the difference between currency and capital, currency is what you have in your spending. It's what's liquid and, you know, it's going back and forth. Capital is your saving. You guys, we all know that, but we need capital if we're going to be stable and if we're going to grow. So capital can take many forms. It can be a savings account, it can be a savings bond. We can invest that into equipment or into land. These are all capital, but these came from having currency. So you can't get capital unless you have extra currency. Okay, you can't save money unless you're first of all earning more than what you're spending. And of course, in our system, the capital is our soil organic matter. It's the long-term saved, stored carbon currency, organic matter, humus, and we could spend the rest of the week if we wanted to just talking about how important soil organic matter is. And if you know nothing else about your soil, if you're only testing one thing in your soil a year, in my opinion, it should be what's your level of soil organic matter, because it tells you how much carbon is in there, and that is an indicator of, are you getting better, are you getting worse, or are you kind of staying about the same? Okay? If you're doing it right, you hopefully are at least staying the same, at the very least, but hopefully getting better. But I'll tell you this, in a corn-soybean system, if you're just growing corn and just growing soybeans, it's going to be extremely difficult for you to ever build up your soil carbon capital. It's very, very rare do we see a soil increase in soil organic matter in a corn bean rotation without having a cover crop in there. And again, that's why cover crops are so important because they're putting carbon into the soil without taking it out. Here's just another slide from Jennifer Moore-Kuchera within NRCS talking about all the different things soil organic matter does. And when we have high organic matter soils, it's like having an economy that is very rich in capital. Okay? They're productive, they're stable, they're resilient, and they're efficient. If you look at the United States, one of the reasons that we have such a strong economy is that we are a capital-rich society. Now, a lot of that capital may be borrowed, but we have access to it. But it's the same way in our high organic matter soil. My soils that are 4 and 5% organic matter, and it's not because we're that great of farmers, it's because it hasn't been farmed that long to have gotten rid of it all. It's grasslands that were broke out relatively recently, but they're always going to be the most productive, they're the most stable, they're the most resilient, they're the most efficient. They're the last ones to show signs of a drought, the last ones to get diseases, and always are going to be the most productive. The higher our organic matter, the more productive they're going to be. On our farm, when we started no-tilling back in, my brother started experimenting in the late 80s, we pretty much switched to 100% no-till by the late 90s. When we pretty much switched to no-till, our organic matter levels were about 1.6, 1.7, which, in our area anyways, is pretty typical for something that had been conventionally tillage farmed. After 10 years of no-till, we had brought that up about 3/4 of a point to 8/10, to around the mid-2s, and another 10 years with no-till and adding cover crops in there. Most of our soils now are, they haven't quite doubled, but they're pretty close. We're probably 3.2, 3.3, somewhere in there. So when people tell you you can't build organic matter levels that fast, that's very true. If you're not doing something other than just growing corn and soybeans, you'll never grow. And in fact, you're going to be going down and down and down. But when you start adding in cover crops and more diverse rotation and some of these other things, you can start building the organic matter levels. About 0.1% per year is a pretty good goal to shoot for. If you can do that, you're doing pretty good. You can't increase your savings account unless you have excess income. It's just a rule. You cannot do that. And you will never increase your organic matter levels unless you're putting more carbon into your soil than what's leaving. And how does carbon leave your soil, or how does carbon leave your fields? Well, when you put corn or soybeans in a truck and haul it away, that's a lot of carbon leaving. Now, that's what we're selling, so we have to do that. Okay, we're not going to stop doing that. But every time you do a tillage operation, every time you leave that soil bare, you're losing carbon in lots of different ways. So unless you're putting more carbon into the soil than what's being removed, you're never going to build your organic matter levels. You just can't do it. So that's why cover crops are so important. That's why we're so sold on them, because that's what's putting carbon into the soil, even on a cold day, but the sun is shining like this, I'm getting some carbon put into my soil. And Christine Jones says that, there's when a plant grows and it dies, so like when you harvest corn, you got all that corn stover on the ground. Okay, there's a lot of carbon there, no doubt about it. But that carbon, as it decomposes, some of that is going to return to the atmosphere as CO2. She says the carbon that a plant puts into the soil through the roots is 5 times more likely to become part of the organic matter of your soil than carbon that comes from decomposing residue on the top. So that's why she's saying it's much more important to have roots growing than to have all the litter up above. From building organic matter, now from protecting the soil, you still have to have all that residue on top, or whatever you build is going to wash away or blow away. So they're both important, but unless we have a growing plant that's actively putting carbon into the soil, you're really going to struggle with trying to build your soil organic matter levels. Okay, energy and resources. Our economy is driven by solar energy. This is the energy source for this process, photosynthesis, and it's free. The government hasn't figured out a way to tax sunshine yet. They're probably talking about it somewhere. I won't get into politics here. But our economy is driven with free energy. Okay, all we have to do is put up solar collectors and collect all this free energy that's out there. And our solar collectors in agriculture are so much cheaper, so much easier to install. We plant seeds. And out pop these little solar panels, these green solar panels. They collect solar energy. They're turning solar energy into chemical energy through that glucose molecule. And eventually it becomes things that we can sell. Much cheaper, much easier than man-made solar panels. And we can say that a healthy soil economy should not need significant purchased energy inputs. And we know that you can have a very healthy soil economy without having any energy inputs, because our soils here were built from tall grass prairies, mixed and tall grass prairies, that grew for thousands of years without anybody spending anything on diesel fuel or propane or electricity or anything else. We can build really good soils without any additional energy other than the sun. Now, when we start exporting things, like when we haul corn off or hay bale or soybeans, now we have to start adding some energy back into the system. So I'm not saying that we can reduce all of our energy inputs, or eliminate all of them, but again, we should look at how can we reduce the amount of energy that we're using in our farm. And if I was to ask you, what is the biggest energy use on your farm? You know, some of you may say, well, it's diesel fuel, or it's propane, or natural gas, or electricity, and those are all significant expenses. But when I look at my farm, and I would guess when most of you would look at your farm, the number one energy expense is not going to be any of the things that I just talked about. The number one energy expense that we have on our farms is nitrogen fertilizer. And I'll show you why that is here next. So we were talking about energy and how the number one energy use on your farm is not going to be anything made out of petroleum, or it's not going to be diesel fuel or gasoline or propane. It's going to be nitrogen. And here's why. Because the number one resource that our plants need is carbon. Plants need more carbon than anything else to grow. The reason we never talk about it, the reason we never worry about it, is because we pull it out of the atmosphere. Number two is nitrogen. We spend all day long talking about that, but look at this. So this is a chart made up of, this is what our atmosphere is made up of. So this tiny little pink line right up here, a little sliver, you can barely see it, that's how much CO2 is in the atmosphere. Okay, 0.038, it's, I don't know, depending on who you listen to, maybe getting close to 0.04. So 4/100ths of 1%. That's how much CO2 is in the atmosphere. Yet you can grow a 300 bushel corn crop, and that plant can pull all of the carbon that it needs to grow that corn crop out of this tiny little sliver of the atmosphere. Okay? The big blue block here, 78%, that's how much nitrogen is in the atmosphere. Okay? We spend $0 on carbon. We spend billions of dollars on nitrogen. But there is, over every acre of crop ground in the United States, there are 30,000 tons of nitrogen sitting right over the top of it. Think about that, 30,000 tons of nitrogen above every crop acre in the United States, and yet we spend billions of dollars to put nitrogen on our soil. Well, why is that? Well, there's good news and there's bad news. Okay? The good news is that we're not dead. Okay? Because atmospheric nitrogen is held as dinitrogen. It's two nitrogen molecules, and they're bonded together with each other. Very, very strong. There's 3 sets of bonds that hold these things together. It's very difficult to pull those apart, and because of that, it's inert. And that's good because you breathe it in, you breathe it out. It's inert, it doesn't do anything. I'm sure everybody in here has caught a whiff of anhydrous ammonia. That's nitrogen that is not inert. Can you imagine what life on this planet would be like if our atmospheric nitrogen was not nitrogen? No, you couldn't imagine it because you wouldn't be alive to begin with. So that's the good news, is that we're not dead. The bad news is, just like you breathe in nitrogen, your body does nothing with it, you just breathe it right back out. It's in and it's out, it's in and it's out. Plants do the exact same thing. Okay? They will breathe in the atmosphere in order to get this CO2 molecule. Okay? They have to take in atmospheric air to get that CO2. They're not just filtering out CO2, they're bringing in all this nitrogen into their plant tissue as well. They can do absolutely nothing with it. It just has to be expelled right back out. So they take it in, they take it out, they can do nothing with it. So all that nitrogen, 30,000 tons of nitrogen setting above each acre of crop ground, our plants can do absolutely nothing with it. So if we want the plant to be able to do something with it, we have to break these nitrogen molecules apart. We call that getting fixed or made plant available. You have to combine it with hydrogen or oxygen to put it into these other forms like ammonium and ammonia. And then the plant can do something with it because it's no longer this N2 molecule. It's broken apart and it's just a single nitrogen molecule. And now the plants can do something with that. And so back in the last century, a couple scientists named Haber and Bosch came up with this method of being able to pull the nitrogen molecules apart, but it involved extremely complex and expensive industrial processes to do this. And so the expense here, when you pay for nitrogen fertilizer, you're not paying for the nitrogen. Okay, there's 30,000 tons of it above every acre. That's free. What you're paying for is the energy that it takes to put it into a form that your plant can use. So when you're saying we're using nitrogen, yes, you are, but you're paying for the energy that it costs to pull this apart. And these nitrogen production factories like this were really built during World War II to make bombs, because when you pull this nitrogen molecule apart and you put it into these other forms, it becomes very, the energy potential in it is huge. And if you remember, I think last year was the 25th anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombings. Timothy McVeigh blew up the federal building there. What did he use? As ammonium nitrate. That's all he had. A rental van and ammonium nitrate and a fuse, and he blew up that huge building. So when you pull this nitrogen molecule apart, there's a lot of energy. And so what it takes man billions of dollars to do, because we spend billions of dollars on nitrogen fertilizer every year, God created these tiny little bacteria that do the exact same thing at a very microscopic level, but they're doing the same thing. So rhizobia bacteria, we all know about rhizobia, they can colonize the roots of legume plants. And don't ever tell anybody that I'm growing soybeans, they can make their own nitrogen. Not true. Soybeans can't make their own nitrogen. They can't do anything with nitrogen molecules. It has to go through the bacteria. Now they will allow this rhizobia bacteria to form these colonies, these nodules, on their roots, and then they essentially trade carbon for nitrogen. So these rhizobia, they can pull that nitrogen molecule apart, which is pretty cool, and the science behind that is way beyond me, so I'm not going to try to explain that to you. But I do know this, they don't do that for free. And you will never see this happen unless this plant, this soybean plant, is willing to give up the carbon that it's making through photosynthesis and feed these things, okay? They're purchasing the nitrogen by delivering carbon through photosynthesis to these bacteria. The bacteria is paying for its food supply by giving nitrogen back to the plant. Very cool relationship, very cool symbiosis going on there. So we don't have to fertilize our soybeans, okay? Well, why can't we do that with corn, with other grass plants? Well, rhizobia, of course, are common only to legumes, but there are other critters out there, there's other organisms out there that will work with non-legume plants. So we have things like Azospirillum, we've got Zotobacter, there's other ones that are discovering new ones all the time. These are called free-living nitrogen fixers. They do the same thing as the rhizobia do. They can pull that nitrogen molecule apart, then they can make that into something that plants can use, and essentially they will sell it to the highest bidder, and they will trade that nitrogen to a grass plant or corn plant or whatever in exchange for the carbon that they're producing. So the question is, how come we don't just load up on these guys and forget putting any nitrogen on at all? Well, the answer is in the scale. So rhizobia are incredibly powerful, incredibly productive. If you're growing 75 bushel soybeans, it probably is taking 350 pounds of nitrogen to do that. How many of us would grow soybeans if you had to put 350 pounds of nitrogen on them? We think we have nitrate problems now, right? If we had to do that, no, nobody would do that. But it takes about 350 pounds of nitrogen to grow 75, 80 bushel soybeans. But we don't put it on because these guys are producing that much. They can produce 300 to 400 pounds of nitrogen essentially in 2 to 3 months. Very, very productive, very, very powerful, and we can grow these big legume crops. These guys, not so much. 30 to 40, maybe 50 pounds of nitrogen is where they're going to max out at in a year. So they're not very productive. They're free living, so they don't form those colonies like the rhizobia do. They're going to live as individual organisms throughout the soil, so they don't have that collaborative force that rhizobia do. And so they're much less productive, but they're still there. But if you think about it, how much corn could you raise if you had 40 pounds of nitrogen? Probably not very much, so this isn't really going to be an answer to that. But what does 40 pounds of nitrogen do for a cover crop? What does 40 pounds of nitrogen do for a forage crop? It makes all the difference in the world if you can have these guys out there helping produce the nitrogen for those things. So they're important to have. They're not going to be a substitute. And the other thing is they're also not going to work if you have excess nitrogen in the soil. So with rhizobia, if you have a lot of nitrogen out there in your soybean field carry over from the corn, the soybeans are going to take all that free nitrogen first before they pay the carbon out for these guys, basically hire these guys. Plants aren't stupid. If you give them free stuff, they're going to take the free stuff before they have to pay for something. Just like people. So you have to, if you're going to grow a legume crop, the best thing to do get all that nitrogen out of the ground, get it tied up somewhere, and then make that legume plant do this process early and often, and then let your excess nitrogen decompose. And that's why cereal rye, a soybean crop, is such a perfect cover crop, because that cereal rye will have all your nitrates in your soil tied up in the plant, forces the soybean to nodulate early, and then come about July and August, as that rye plant is starting to decompose, it starts to slow release that nitrogen that it's sequestered, and it gives soybeans a little bit of that late season boost. So it's a really good system to do. It's more difficult with corn, because with corn, it needs that nitrogen earlier. So anyway, there are things that we can use to help the plants with these things. And but all of these things have to trade nitrogen to the plant for carbon. And so again, we see the importance of carbon driving the system. And if your plants aren't photosynthesizing, if they're not making that carbon, then these processes are not going to happen. They're not going to help them very well. Other mineral resources that our plants need, we talk about carbon and nitrogen, but we've got all these other things: phosphorus, and potassium, and magnesium, zinc, copper, iron, etc., etc. Our plants need lots of these things. They are in our soils, but not in a form that the plants can get to. So what we need to do is we have to employ lots of tiny little miners to go get them. Okay? I love this article. This was published in Scientific America a while back. The title says, "Mycorrhizal fungi are the largest mining operation in the world." Typically, when you think about a mining operation, you think about these giant trucks. Once in a while, you'll see a tire going down the highway. It's like one semi hauls one tire for these big mining trucks. But this is all happening at a microscopic scale, but there's so much of it going on that when you link it all together, it's the largest mining operation in the world. And so what this picture here, this is from this article, this is a highly magnified piece of feldspar. So just think of that as a tiny little grain of sand, okay? And they've magnified this, and these things that look like tunnels or channels cut into this are actually tunnels or channels cut into this. These are hollowed out mine shafts, if you will, into this solid piece of feldspar. And the way that this was done is that mycorrhiza can secrete the right chemicals, the right acids, that literally dissolve solid rock. They will dissolve this rock, this mineral, and they will pull that out as liquid mineral now, and they will take that back to their host plant, and they will sell it to them for carbon. Because as cool as these guys are, and here's another picture of them, they actually live inside the plant roots. This is what they call the arbuscle, and then the hyphae comes out and explores the soil. But as cool as these things are, and they can dissolve solid rock, and they can bring all these minerals back, they cannot eat those. That is not a food source for them, and they cannot produce their own carbon. They can do nothing with atmospheric CO2. They have to be provided that carbon food source from a plant. And so that's why this symbiotic relationship here works so well, because these guys are getting fed. They don't actually have to have root exudates here. They're pulling that carbon straight out of the root, and then these hyphae are going out and exploring the soil. And I got some more pictures of this here in a little bit. But the author to this article, Jennifer Fraser, says mycorrhizal fungi mine the soils not only for basic things, but for the hard to come by things like zinc, copper, manganese, which plants need for strong immune system health and survival. Oddly enough, many soils are rich in important nutrients, but they're often locked up in a physical form, which makes them unavailable to most plants. And that's so true. We have these things in our soils, but unless you have biology making it available to your plants are always going to show signs of these nutrient deficiencies, these mineral deficiencies. And then what do? We have to step in with those welfare payments, and we have to go get the jug or the sprayer, and we have to put those on because we no longer have the biology making them available. A couple years ago, we had worked with Scott Garnerman, who just down the road here, we did a workshop when we had Christine Jones, who I referenced earlier, a microbiologist. And she was there, and she was talking about this concept, and Ray Ward was there with Ward Labs, and she said, "Ray, how much phosphorus do you have in your soils?" Because Ray has a farm down in western Nebraska, just north of Fairbury there. She said, "Ray, how much phosphorus do you have in your soil?" And he, 15 parts per million, 20 parts per million, or whatever. And she said, "No, I don't want to know, what's plant available. I want to know total phosphorus in your soil." And of course, most of us would have no idea, but because Ray has his own soil lab, he knew the answer to that because he's done that test. And so I can't even remember what the answer was. She threw that number out there, and then she asked him this question. She said, how many years worth of crop production would that be? And so he was sort of scribbling around on his paper, and he kind of looked at it, and was like, that can't be right. And then finally he looked up and he said, I have enough phosphorus in my soils to grow crops for the next 10,000 years. And she says, yeah, that's right. Most people do. Most people do, but the plants can't get to it because plants were never designed to get to those minerals directly. It all has to go through the biology. And when we have biology, it makes these things available. And mycorrhiza are one of the best for helping release that phosphorus and bring it back to the plant. More on mycorrhiza later. But we move into the infrastructure now. We talked about the energy, the resources, now infrastructure. Infrastructure is basic equipment and structures that are needed for a country to function properly. And the two most important infrastructures are transportation and communication. We know these are important because in times of war, this is what we do to our enemy. We try to destroy their infrastructure. Because we know it's a proven fact, if you can destroy infrastructure, particularly transportation and communication, you will literally bring an economy to its knees. You'll literally destroy the economy of the country if you disrupt that infrastructure. And so as I was thinking about that, as I was putting this talk together, I was thinking about, the infrastructure of the United States. The first thing that comes to mind is the interstate highway system. One of the reasons that we're such a strong economy is we have a good infrastructure for transportation. So the national interstate system, we've got these big roads, multi-lane, can move large amounts of goods, services back and forth. Very effective, very efficient, but some people, like me, I'm only 20 miles off the Kansas border down here, so I'm about 50, 60 miles up here to I-80, I'm about 80 miles down to I-70. I can't utilize an interstate unless I can get there, okay? So what really makes, this is important, but what really makes this tick is when you lay the highway system in with the interstate system. Now, there are not too many people, at least not too many highly populated areas that live very far away from a pretty good highway that takes you to a better highway that will eventually get you to an interstate and allow you to move goods and services very quickly and very efficiently throughout. But it's not just the interstates that make it work, it's all the feeder roads that go into it that makes it work. And it's the same way with our plants, okay? This is the interstate highway system. So these are some pretty famous pictures from a company that makes mycorrhizal fungi inoculant. So they've got a picture of a plant here with no mycorrhizal formations, no associations. It's just the plant roots. Plant roots are like the interstates. They're big, they can move large amounts of goods and services up and down, but they can only get to what they touch. Okay, interstates are only as good as getting to the interstate. So this is very effective in a very small area. And so if there's moisture, if there's nutrients over here, or over here, or over here, this plant can't take advantage of it because the roots are only right here. So that's why mycorrhiza are so important, because this is what it looks like when it's highly colonized. You've got all of this mycorrhiza growing from the plant root and branching out all throughout the soil. Now this is the feeder system. This is bringing in the nutrients, and it can even bring in water into here. And it's also, the plant can also use this. This plant is photosynthesizing carbon, and it will, these things can release some of the carbon out for other soil organisms as well. So it really makes the transportation infrastructure of soil much, much more effective. Here's another picture, highly magnified. This is a plant root. You can see the arbuscles that are growing in and on the plant root, and then all these little fine hairs. And you can't see these unless you're highly, highly magnified. They're very, very small, very tiny, very fragile, and so you don't really see them that often. It's difficult to know if you've got a lot of mycorrhiza or not. It's hard to test for. And so this is what it looks like under a microscope with all these little fine filament hairs. But they transport phosphorus, which is one of the hardest things to get out of the soil, but also they can pull out nitrogen, potassium, and calcium, all these different things. And in dry times, they actually help transport and supply water. So if you really want to have a drought-tolerant hybrid, to me, it's not as important what hybrid you're planting as if you have mycorrhiza that are out there that are going to colonize those plants. The other cool thing about mycorrhiza is they're not host specific. So most mycorrhiza can live on a corn plant. That same organism can live on a soybean plant. That same organism can live on a rye plant, and they can jump from one host to another. And again, that's why cover crops are so important, because it becomes a bridge to get the mycorrhiza from one crop to the next crop. Because the two things that will absolutely destroy mycorrhiza, number one is tillage, because you can imagine if you've got this very fine hyper network throughout all the soil, what tillage is going to do to that. And number two is fallow periods, when nothing is growing. Because these guys, all the things that they can do, it's really super cool, but they can't feed themselves. They can't photosynthesize, they can't eat the minerals from the soil, they have to have carbon. And so they need the carbon to be fed to them from the plants in order to survive. So again, cover crops are a bridge to help us keep the biology alive until the next crop is ready for it. But it's not just mycorrhiza that helps transport things through the soil. We've got things that earthworms in particular are extremely important. You can see this clod. I don't know how well you can see. There's an earthworm coming out of a burrow here, burrow. You know, this is just pockmarked with earthworm burrows all over the place. This was pulled right off the soil surface. What is soil like this going to do when I get a big rain? I get that 3-inch rain that comes in 2 hours. Am I going to have much runoff off of this? Very little, as long as I got good soil cover. Because look, I've got these big channels that's transporting that water, that moisture, right down into my soil. Hugely important. So earthworm channels are very important with that. Old root channels are too. But it can also, oxygen is important. Roots are only going to grow as deep as your oxygen is in your soil. Yeah, so the question is, how long do I have after I kill my cover crop before I have to have my next crop growing, before I start losing organisms? The answer to that is I'm not really sure. But I do know this. And see, I'm not very smart, Dean, but I know a lot of smart people, and I can listen to them. So what I have heard Christine and Joe Clapperton and others say is that the warmer it is, the shorter the period of time you have to get that transfer done. Okay? Because the warmer it is, the more active these things are, the faster they're growing, the more food they need. So probably 2 weeks in warm conditions before you start dropping off populations because they have no food source. In cold, you know, because throughout the winter there's very little growing, but the mycorrhiza aren't growing much either. So if you have to have a fallow period and it's during the cold part of the year, that's probably okay. But come March 15th, when it starts to warm up and things are starting to green up, if you don't have a cover crop out there, that mycorrhiza is going to come to life and they're not going to find a food source. So probably 2, maybe 3 weeks is about all that I would like to see gap between when you kill the cover crop and when your next crop starts growing. Did that answer that question? Okay. Okay, so yes, we're going to get tremendous amounts of infiltration with this. So earthworms are your friend. You should be farming in such a way that you have lots of earthworms. If you go out with a spade and you're digging in your soils and you're finding very few or no earthworms, like we used to never see any earthworms, you don't have a very good soil. Your soil biology is very low. This is the best test you can do because it's free. Buy a shovel, go dig some holes, see if you got worms. If you got worms, you got some stuff happening out there. Now, that's not going to tell you if you have mycorrhiza and a lot of these other things, but it's at least going to tell you that you've got an environment where the biology is starting to live and work and move, and that's a good sign. And if you see 1 or 2, that's good, and if you start seeing 4, 5, 6, that's even better. So the more worms you can get, the better off you are, because they're going to transport a lot of these things, oxygen, surface carbon residue, all these things, very important part of the system. Communication is the other infrastructure that's very important. Think about how our economy would be crippled if all of a sudden we leave this room, you can no longer make a phone call, you can no longer send a text, you can no longer send an email. It would grind our economy to a halt. It would be a disaster. So communication is extremely important, and it's no different in plants. And if you think about it, I was talking about mycorrhiza in particular, but other biology as well, because they can bring everything to the plant, everything from nitrogen, phosphorus, boron, copper, all these different things they can bring to the plant But some of these plants are very sensitive to some of it. And if they need a little bit of boron to grow, but if they get too much, what's it going to do to the plant? It'll probably kill the plant. So how does the mycorrhiza know what to bring to the plant? It can't just be bringing everything and leaving it there and going, well, I didn't know what you want, so I just brought everything. It would kill the plants. So the plants are telling the mycorrhiza and the bacteria and all of the other critters, it's telling them what they need through communication, and it's using liquid carbon root exudates to do that. So remember, photosynthesis, we created C6H12O6, glucose. It doesn't stay as glucose, it gets turned and combined into all these other things, amino acids, flavonoids, lots of different things. And then each one of these different compounds is a signal to the biology that the plant is wanting something different. So I can't even pronounce half of these, let alone tell you what it's signaling. But basically each one of these is a signal to a different type of biology to bring in a different product or a different nutrient or something from the soil. So it's extremely sophisticated, extremely complicated. When you go out in the soil, you just see a plant, you just think, well, dumb plant, it can't even move. And very, very sophisticated systems of communicating its needs to its surrounding environment. Here's that picture I was telling you about earlier. This is a plant root, and it is exuding, these are liquid root exudates. Okay, these could be carbohydrates or sugars or proteins, fats, lipids, oils. These are all carbon compounds right here. Okay, it all started out as glucose, then it gets combined and put into these different types of compounds. And it's using these liquid root exudates to communicate what it needs to the biology. Now the reason this picture is so unique, this picture was taken by Jimmy Emmons. Some of you may have heard Jimmy speak. He's a really good farmer and a soil health advocate from Oklahoma. He took this picture, and what's kind of interesting about this, he took this with his iPhone, okay? And if you're interested in doing this kind of stuff, if you're kind of geek out on some of these soil things, you can get a $99, it's called the Pro Scope, fits right on your iPhone, and it essentially turns it into a little microscope. This is not mycorrhiza, it's not high enough magnification to really see mycorrhiza, but it is high enough magnification. We can see these root hairs. And what do you see on these root hairs? You see all these droplets of liquid. I don't know that I've ever seen another picture quite like this, because what happens when you pull a plant up out of the ground? What happens to all those root hairs? They pull right off. So if you're really, really careful and you dig it up and you do what's called a root wash, you can preserve those root hairs and you can see them. But what happens to these little droplets of liquid in the process of doing a root wash? They're gone. You never see them. So the reason that this picture is so unique is because this was taken, a worm channel going down this way, and Jimmy had cover crop cereal rye out here. So there was a worm channel going down, and this rye root is going sideways. And so when he dug this up and he kind of broke it open, it broke right at that wormhole. So what you're seeing here was not actually even in the soil. This was growing through the wormhole. So this was growing essentially in the air of that wormhole. There'd be soil here and soil here, but this was in the void of that worm burrow. So that's why he was able to capture it with all of those little droplets on it. So think about it. Think of the diameter of a wormhole. You know, that little worm burrow, you know what, maybe 1/8 of an inch, unless you got big old night crawlers, probably 1/8 of an inch. So this whole distance that we're seeing here, he magnified it as much as he could, but that's only probably 1/8 of an inch long. Okay, now, if you could count how many little droplets of liquid are on this would be a good math experiment for somebody. If you could count all of those, then you would have to multiply that by 8 to get how much would be in 1 inch of a rye root. And Dean, you want to take a guess at how many miles of rye roots are in an acre? Take a good guess, because I don't know the answer, so I'm not going to tell you wrong. I don't know. It's thousands and thousands of miles of roots in an acre of soil on this cover crop cereal rye, and this rye was probably only 8 inches tall. But look at how many droplets of these liquid carbon exudates this is pumping into the soil, feeding all of my biology, all these different compounds, and it's preparing the soil for that next crop. Because he's not going to harvest this rye, it's just a cover crop, okay? But it's not just a cover crop, because what it's doing is it's preparing the soil, it's ramping up the biology, and it's getting it ready for when he's going to plant corn into this a few weeks down the road. So that's why we do cover crops. It's because we want to prepare the soil and prepare the biology for the next crop. Okay, other things in communication. So plants communicate with those liquid root exudates, but plants can communicate with each other, and they can communicate with insects in a couple of different ways. I find this whole topic extremely fascinating. I don't really understand it very well. There's lots of good resources out there. Dr. Jack Schultz is with the University of Missouri. He's got a really good TED Talk out on YouTube if you want to search for that, just talking about this. I think National Geographic maybe had a whole hour-long series called What Plants Talk About. Fascinating stuff, really good stuff. But essentially, what they have found in doing these different experiments is these plants can talk to each other, go through the root system, okay? And what I've been told is plant roots themselves will never physically intersect with each other. Okay, so there's no physical way for a plant root to communicate with another plant root. They may be touchy, but they won't actually exchange any material. What allows them to communicate through their root system is when I have mycorrhizal, because remember, it grows inside the root, and it can grow inside the roots of multiple plants. And so you may have one mycorrhizal organism that may cover 20 square feet. And in fact, they've seen in some of the forests up in the Pacific Northwest, they say the largest living organism in the planet is a mycorrhizal type fungus. It covers hundreds of square miles, one organism. And it just goes from this tree to that tree to this tree to that tree, and it ties them all together. Essentially, the World Wide Web, I think they called it the World Wood Web up in the forest, is what they, in the article I read. But it ties it together, and somehow it allows these plants to communicate. So what they're showing here, they've had experiments where this plant gets infected by aphids, okay? And so when a plant gets infected by a pest or a disease, it will change the physiology of the plant. The plant starts producing different chemical compounds to try to protect itself. So this plant is under attack. This plant over here is not yet under attack. See, the aphids are still up in the air. This is high quality graphics, so no, these are aphids. This plant is not yet under attack, but yet it's already started ramping up its defenses because this plant told it. Said, watch out, mate, aphids are about. So this must be a Australian graphic or something. But so this plant is communicating over to this plant so it can start ramping up its defense. Really fascinating stuff. There's an article in the Scientist magazine talking about this type of thing in great detail. Just again talking about how plants can communicate through the root system, how they can communicate through the air with these volatile organic compounds, essentially smells or perfumes. You know how when you're out and you cut the grass, and you got that fresh mown grass smell? We all think that's really nice. That's really a cry for help, because that grass plant is releasing these things saying, hey, we're under attack. Yeah, think about that next time you're out mowing the yard, right? But it's essentially communicating. And there's other volatile compounds that it will put out to communicate to insects. So when it's under attack by aphids, it will release the right chemical compounds, the fragrances, and it will signal in an airstrike, if you will, from predatory insects like these syphiloid flies or ladybugs or lacewings, things like that. So these can be called in because they can detect which plants are emitting these signals, these help signals, and it can zero right in on the plant that's being attacked. But that does absolutely no good if you have none of these predatory insects around. So that's a whole other thing about soil health, is when you have cover crops, when you have some of these different things, you tend to have a much more diverse insect population. And when you have that, if you can keep some populations of some of these predatory insects around, then when your plant starts to come under attack by a bad bug, these things can be called in for help. Okay, the last section, defense and protection, and then I got a little bit of a summary, and then we'll see if we have time for some questions. Defense and protection. Our soil economy needs protected because there's lots of things that want to attack and steal. And that's one thing, anytime you get a really robust, strong economy, you're always going to be under attack. I have to be a little careful here. You're always going to be under attack by those who want to take without giving. Those who want to consume without producing. Okay? I don't care what economy you're in, that's going to happen. And it's no different in our farming economy, our soil economy. We have to be protected from water. We need water. But too much of it or too little of it is bad. You've all seen the destructive raindrop pictures here. This is like a bomb exploding because there was no protection on the soil. Wind, okay? This is a picture from the 30s. I've seen pictures exactly like this. Maybe the house was different, but the air is no different from just this past year, in eastern Colorado. And it was, just a few years ago when somebody was killed right out here on Interstate 80 because of blowing soil, reduced visibility. So we have to be protected from water and wind and heat and cold and compaction and weeds and insects and diseases. Lots of things want to attack our economy, so we have to protect it. First line of defense is get your soil covered. It's the easiest thing we can do. It's the best thing you can do. Rolf Dirsch, who is one of the godfathers of soil health and no-till in South America, he is a German guy, but he worked extensively in Paraguay and Brazil. And he spoke over here in the United States several times. He says almost all advantages of the no-till system come from the permanent cover of the soil, and only a few of the advantages from not tilling the soil. So in other words, what he's saying is the physical act of not tilling the soil isn't nearly as important as the physical act of having the soil covered. But the problem is when you till, you're getting rid of your residue. And he's saying that's a bigger problem than actually physically breaking down your soil. They're both problems, but he's saying I'd rather have the soil covered, always aim at full soil cover. And boy, that's the truth. We've just seen that year in and year out. Where we have better soil cover, we will grow better crops year in and year out. Number two, defense and protection. We talked about this a little bit. I've got one more example I want to show here, but this is how plants defend themselves. They defend themselves by being able to communicate with these insects, with each other, and utilizing the biological friends that they have against biological enemies. So one more example of how plants can protect themselves. And again, this is an experiment that was done, but this happens all the time with other plants as well. So this is students at the University of Delaware that did this. This is a rock cress plant. I don't know exactly what that is, but some sort of a house plant here or something. It was infected with a pathogen called Pseudomonas syringae, and when that pathogen gets in this plant, it starts to turn the leaves yellow. They start to turn brownish black like this. Pretty soon these leaves will fall off. Pretty soon the plant has no leaves. A plant with no leaves is going to die, and it will kill this plant eventually with this Pseudomonas syringae. Okay, so this plant, it's infected with the same disease pathogen. They put the same pathogen in this pot, but they also put in a beneficial bacteria called Bacillus subtilis. And it's a beneficial bacteria. They introduced both of them into the same pot. So in the soil, we have both the good guys and the bad guys. And this is a highly magnified photograph of one of the roots of this plant right here. And you can see this is the main root. These are the root hairs, and it appears to be covered with this green, slimy-like substance. That's because those root hairs are covered with a green, slimy-like substance, which is made up entirely of Bacillus subtilis. So what happened is this plant, when it figured out that it was under attack by Pseudomonas syringae, it started pumping out the right carbon compounds that signaled Bacillus subtilis. It said, hey, I'm under attack. I've got all the carbon you could ever want to eat right here. Just come and protect me. And so what this does, this bacteria can increase their populations exponentially, extremely quickly. The populations explode, and it essentially just creates a biological film around these roots, and it prevents Pseudomonas syringae from getting into the roots, affecting the plant and affecting the leaves. So this plant is growing a perfectly normal, healthy life, even though it's surrounded by pathogens. The difference is it's got enough good guys in there to offset the bad guys. And so often in our soils, because we go out and we kill everything, the bad guys come back faster than the good guys a lot of times. And so we have no biological controls, so then we're heavily dependent upon input control. So if we can utilize the right bacteria, have the right balance, nature really takes care of herself pretty well. A third line of defense is that healthy plants produce complex compounds, which give some natural resistance. Now, I will freely admit, I really don't understand this very well. This guy is a really, really smart guy, John Kemp. Has anybody in here heard John Kemp speak? Okay, John Kemp, he's an Amish guy. 8th grade education is as far as he went to school. Brilliant, brilliant man. He's speaking at No-Till on Plains this year. I've never heard him speak. He's on my bucket list to listen to, so I'm going to get to listen to him in January down in Wichita. But he has all of these, he goes around, does lots of talks. He has a consulting business. But what he's saying is that plants, basically at the bottom level of this pyramid, they're doing photosynthesis, and it's got that glucose molecule. Remember C6H12O6? It's a very simple sugar. It's easily digested. Easily digested. Insects have very, very simple digestive systems. They cannot digest very complex foods. But glucose, they can get something done with that. So he's saying that when your plant is down here and all it's doing is photosynthesis, it's going to be susceptible to a lot of insect attacks, a lot of disease attacks. But as your plant makes this glucose into more complex compounds like proteins and lipids and then these post-secondary metabolites up here, as the complexity of these molecules get higher and higher, he says these plants will just naturally become insect resistant. Because when you get up into this level up here, insects can't digest lipids. And so they'll suck some sap out of this plant, they'll go, that gives me a stomach ache, I'm going to move on and find a different plant. That's why you'll see some plants infected and others that aren't. You'll see some fields that are infected and the neighboring field won't be, and it's because of what is in them. Insects can only digest certain things, the same with diseases. So basically what he's saying is that healthy plants become resistant to disease and insects, and healthy plants are coming from these healthy soils because they have to have access to all of these micronutrients that they need, and the best way to do that is not through a jug, but it's through a bug. And so when we have the bugs out there, the biology out there that's making all this available to the plant, we're going to get much healthier plants, and these healthy plants have far less disease and pest problems. So that's my explanation of that. I don't understand it very well. I'm looking forward to listening to him in January. Hopefully I'll have a better explanation. A fourth line of defense is just additional symbiotic relationships. This is just a quick picture of a plant root from the Nobel Research Institute. This is an endophyte fungus. An endophyte is a fungus that lives inside the plant root. This is different than mycorrhiza. This will live inside the plant root. The plant is feeding this fungus carbon, so the fungus stays alive. The fungus stays entirely inside the plant root. It is not going out and exploring. It is staying inside the plant root, but what it does is it gives these plants much better drought tolerance and much better tolerance to diseases and pests. And then a fifth line of defense is just simply have diversity. Because usually when something attacks, whether it's a disease, whether it's an insect, or some other kind of pest, it's only going to attack one or two types of plants. But if I have a cover crop mix like this out there, a very diverse, 10, 12, 15 way mix, the seed's going to look like this. If you're an insect or a disease coming in here, you may take out one or two of those things, but I'm not too worried about it because I got plenty of others that can grow and fill in this spot. So one of the best things that we can do to defend ourselves is just simply have diversity. Have a lot of diversity out there, and most of us are really going to struggle to get diversity in our cash cropping systems, okay? We've started growing more diverse things, but it's hard. We probably lost as much money growing some of this weird stuff as we make money because we didn't know what we're doing. Because we're trying to take it all the way out to harvest grain. But I can grow all of these things, and I don't have to know much because I'm not trying to take it to grain harvest. I'm just letting it grow up, and when it dies, and the soil will consume it, the biology consumes it. That's pretty easy to add my diversity this way. So it's much easier to add diversity through our cover crops than it is to try to put it in our cash cropping system. So to summarize, these are the different things that we've talked about. These are all the keys to a healthy economy, but also all the keys to a healthy soil. And I've just got 8 really quick points to summarize. And again, I think she said that everybody's going to get a copy of these slides. Also, there's a couple versions of this talk on our YouTube channel if you're interested. If you want to share this with somebody, just go to YouTube and search for green cover seed. You can pull this whole talk back up, including the drill coming out off the tractor too. Economies are intricately interconnected and interdependent, and when we mess with one part of the economy, we're going to mess with the whole system. And when we take biology out of the system with the way that we're farming, we definitely mess up the relationships here. And so when that happens, then we have to give it more welfare payments. We have to put more inputs on, and again, I'm not advocating that we completely eliminate them. That's not the goal on our farm. We want to reduce them as much as we can because that's where profitability is going to come from. When I can reduce these and get the biology working more the way that it was created to do. Get these guys doing as much of the job as possible, and then I supplement with what they're not able to do. Number 3, increase your cash flow of carbon currency. Okay? Your banker always wants to see your cash flow. Well, if you want to increase the cash flow of your carbon currency, you need to do more than just grow these 2 things. Because when you're just growing corn and soybeans, you're less than 50% efficient in collecting solar energy and turning that into liquid carbon. All that solar energy is free, and if you don't have something growing, you're wasting it. You don't get it back. You don't get a second chance at it. It's free energy that you can pump into your soil, but when there's nothing growing, you're wasting the opportunity. So you need to get a cover crop in there. Maybe even consider doing a 3rd cash crop, maybe integrate cattle. These are ways that you can capture more of that solar energy and either turn it into something that you can sell here or turn it into something that is going to improve your soil and set you up for a better next crop. Number 4, make capital investments of long-term carbon and don't sell off those investments. So once you have that currency through your cover crops or through additional cropping, then you can turn it into soil organic matter. Cattle can help do that if you manage them right, but don't sell off those investments. Don't do this, because when you're making an investment, you don't go out and buy stocks and bonds just to turn around and sell them the next week, at least not if you're in a long-term investment. So if you're doing no-till and cover crops and you're doing all that, then all of a sudden you come out and you do some of these operations when you don't really need to me, that's like you're selling off those investments. You're not investing for the long term. These are very short-term things, and you're not building for the long term. Number 5, take advantage of the free tiny workers. They manufacture, they'll mine, they'll transport, communicate, they'll protect. They work extremely cheap. They literally work for carbon. And the more biological diversity you can have in your soils, the better off you're going to be. Number 6, build and do not destroy your infrastructure. You'll really see your economy grow. Strive to do a farming system where you can encourage the mycorrhizal growth. Earthworms, you can't see this stuff. Earthworms are easy to see, okay? So don't worry about these things until you start seeing plenty of these. Because if you don't have earthworms, you probably don't have much else out there either. So farm in such a way that you can do this, build that infrastructure so you can get the better water infiltration, so you can be pulling in more nutrients. And then once you have that infrastructure, don't do this. Because this is, remember I said a wartime strategy is you destroy the infrastructure of your enemy. So when you do this and you don't have to, you're literally declaring war on your soil. Number 7, protect your economy with soil armor. Keep it covered as often as you can. These are some pictures from some of our farms. You know, this is what we like to see. We don't always see this. It's not always like this. But we like to see that ground covered at all times as much as possible. And then number 8, diversity is so very important for a healthy economy. Plants, roots, soil, animals. Figure out a way to get more diversity into your operation because that's really going to move the needle for you. So that's Carbonomics. That's kind of comparing what's going on in the soil to the economy of the country. Hopefully it kind of put things in a little bit different perspective for you, maybe understand some of those concepts. So, okay, good question. So the question was, which type of nitrogen fertilizer do we use on our farm? Why and how do we time that? We pretty much are just using liquid 32. We went away from anhydrous quite a few years ago. You know, the 46% dry, we've used that, but we don't really have the right equipment to do that with. So most of our nitrogen going onto our corn crop, we're streaming on with our sprayer. We're putting it with stream bars, and we'll put that on either right after we plant or sometimes right before, depends on when we think we can catch a rain. But when you have a cover crop growing out there, you do not want to put your nitrogen out very early because you don't want the cover crop to take up the nitrogen you're putting out there. You want the cover crop to take up the nitrogen that was left over from the previous crop. So your timing has to be quite a bit different. So we never put any nitrogen on very much ahead of time unless we've already killed that cover crop. And sometimes we will do that on our dry land. We'll tend to terminate those spring cover crops earlier if we think it's going to be a dry spring. And of course, you know, our guess is about as good as anybody's is what that looks like. But if it feels like it's going to be dry, we'll pull the trigger and terminate that cover crop earlier, and we may put that nitrogen out sooner. But we will not fertilize a growing cover crop. because we don't want the nitrogen to get into that cover crop. We want it to get into our cash crop. And so we put on a fairly low rate, just a dryland rate, and then everything else for our irrigated corn goes through the pivots. When we're growing some of these other crops like rye, triticale, wheat, barley, things like that, we'll generally do a split application of liquid in the spring, once after green up and once about food. So we manage that about like you would wheat. And then some of the other weird crops like buckwheat, sunflowers, and some of those, sometimes they'll get fertilized, sometimes they won't. Kind of depends on where they're at in the rotation. If I'm growing them with a legume crop, then I typically don't fertilize them at all. But it's pretty much all liquid is what we're using.